Welcome to another episode of The Art of Bird Photography. On The Art of Bird Photography, I talk about composition, lighting, and a little bit of other stuff related to taking better bird photos. And right now I'm just doing post-processing, but I also plan on doing other things like advice in the field and other stuff like that. But right now I'm starting with post-processing because I do believe that post-processing is one of the hardest aspects of bird photography. So what do we have here? We have a photo of a yellow-tailed black cockatoo. It's an Australian species. I took this photo 7 years ago, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how this photo could be improved. I did some basic editing here, exposure, tone curve, but there's still a lot to be done here, a lot of things that could be improved. I'll start out with discussing what could have been done better in camera, first of all. So at this point, I was just starting out in bird photography. I didn't know some of the things I know now, and let's talk about one of them, which relates to the camera settings. Now, if you look at the camera settings, pretty decent settings, f7.1, 300 millimeters. Back then, I actually shot with a 300 millimeter lens. Now I shoot with a 500 millimeter lens. Now, would a 500 millimeter lens get me a better picture in this case? Well, if we look at the cropping, it looks like I did a fairly serious crop here. I think in this case, yes, a 500 millimeter lens probably would have gotten me a better result. But still, the picture looks fairly decent even at 300 millimeters. But there's one thing about the camera settings that I see that maybe could have been improved. Now I see I shot it at 1/400th of a second, and that's not a bad setting. That's a perfectly good setting for bird photography for still birds perched on a branch. After all, if you're shooting at 300 millimeters, 400, even 600 millimeters, you're going to get some camera shake. You're going to want to make sure your shot is pretty sharp. And if you zoom into the shot, yeah, I still have a lot of detail here, but because of just chance, you may be able to nail a shot at a lower shutter speed. So I always recommend that once you get a few guaranteed shots at a higher shutter speed, like 1/400th of a second, I recommend dropping down to 1/200th of a second or even 1/125, just to see if you can get a shot at those lower shutter speeds. Often it won't work, but sometimes it will. So in this case, I didn't do that, but if I knew then what I know now, I would have done that, and maybe I would have gotten a shot at a lower ISO with less noise. And the camera I was using at the time was actually the Pentax K50, which did not have as good noise performance as my Nikon D500, so I think I could have gotten a little bit better image quality than what I got here, but the image quality isn't bad. Composition-wise, would I have done anything different? I like the composition, but one thing I would have tried back then maybe is to move a little bit. I noticed the top right-hand corner of the photo, the bokeh does have some of these like worm-like things in them versus these more circular things in the background here. So I think moving a little bit maybe could have solved that problem, but maybe not, because of course then the framing would have been a little bit different, but it wouldn't have hurt to try. Again, that's something I would have tried if I were a little bit more experienced. Moving a bit could have solved a little bit of this worm bokeh in the top right corner. But now we can't go back and change things, so what can we do in post-processing to make this photo a little bit better? First thing is the right side of the photo. I already told you about the brightness of the bokeh here. It's a little bit distracting. So let's apply a little bit of a mask, darken that side of the photo. You can see that when I activate the mask, it's just a gradient mask with a slight decrease a very slight decrease in the top end, so it doesn't have those very harsh highlights. Also the eye. Eyes are so important in bird photography. If we look closely at the eye is not completely black. Now, I don't generally demand complete blackness, but I do believe the eyes generally look better when the darkest part of the eye is a little bit blacker. And since this photo was boosted a little bit, the shadows were boosted, you're going to get a little bit of a washed out look. And so I do think it's wise to pay some attention to the eye. Let's zoom in a little bit more to the eye. Let's zoom in right to the eye. You see the eye? It's not completely black, so I did add a little bit of a tone curve here. Make the eye a little bit blacker. Some might say that's too extreme, but when you zoom out, it doesn't look that extreme to me. Yeah, just a little bit of blackness in the eye gives a little bit of punch there. And that will help, especially in printing. There's another thing that I often do in bird photos, I really recommend this, is to lighten the top of the frame a little bit, provide a little bit more contrast, because it is the top part of the picture. The light is coming from above, and so the eye expects a little bit more brightness there, and it gives a little bit of emphasis to the head of the bird. So brighten that. See, I added a little bit of another mask, soft gradient mask, and I brighten just the top of that frame. And it gives a little bit more punch to the top, which is kind of, your brain expects that. Your brain expects that punch, so add a little bit of that punch. And another thing that bothers me, and it's not as obvious as the other things I was talking about, but on the right-hand side of the frame, you've got these sort of black, not black, but dark spots on the edge here. And my eye, when I move from left to right, really go to those dark spots. I don't like those dark spots very much. So I activate another tone curve here just to diminish those, not completely get rid of them, because I do like a little bit of the framing. It gives the picture a little bit of framing. But see, I have a very gentle luminosity, a combination of a luminosity and drawn mask here that really gets rid of some of that black. And see, when I turn it on and off, that harsh darkness on the right side due to those spots just generally disappears. And one thing that I do think is a little bit apparent in this photo is this green splotch. There's a green splotch just here in the bokeh that's stronger than the rest of the photo. And you know, that's a part of the natural landscape. I don't want to get rid of it, but I do think it's a little bit apparent. I do think it's has a little bit too much visual weight. And so I do think it's important to diminish stuff like that if you don't want them to have very much visual weight. And I don't want it to have very much visual weight. So I made another mask just to get rid of that. And I brightened it a little bit. You can see a mask. It's, again, a combination of a drawn-in luminosity mask. Now, you may have noticed that when I brightened that a little bit, it did add a little bit of saturation to that area too, and now that looks unnatural. So I also added a color equalizer to diminish the saturation of that spot just slightly. It's another mask thing to decrease the saturation and lighten it a little bit more. So now it blends in a little bit more with the bokeh of the rest of the shot. So first I brightened it, but because the brightening added a little bit of saturation or the appearance of saturation, I then decreased the saturation in that spot. And finally, I can use a color lookup table to further decrease the appearance or the significance of the background, soften that a bit, bring out the darker, cooler tones, and that's the result. So before, after. And that's pretty much it. There are a few other things that could be done with this photo that are optional. You could change a little bit more of the colors, do a few other things, but now I got this photo looking sort of the way I want it. Let me export the before and after shot so you can see that all these little modifications did kind of make a fairly big difference in the way the photo looks. So just to recap, all we did was decrease some of the visual weight of certain background elements and bring out the eye and the top part of the photo just to give the head of the bird a little more impact, especially when it's placed against the newly softened, less impactful background. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Art of Bird Photography. If you have any suggestions, any questions about topics you want me to cover in future episodes, I'd be absolutely happy to do that. Don't forget to give this video a like, and if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please subscribe because that helps me produce more episodes of The Art of Bird Photography and other videos on editing, bird photography, and photography. I wish you the best of luck in your bird photography, and I'll see you again next time.